No hyperspace beacon warned them. No navigation hazard had been charted along the rimward lanes beyond the Hydian Way. Yet entire star systems had begun to fall silent, their traffic logs freezing mid-transmission, their defense grids going dark as if the stars themselves had blinked and forgotten them. What the Empire first catalogued as signal interference soon became something far more disturbing, a pattern of absence spreading across the frontier like an unseen tide. The Force binds all living things, linking breath, heartbeat, and the smallest microbial life into a vast current of existence. But beyond the galactic rim, something had begun to disturb that current, not with rage or hatred, but with a cold, consuming hunger that left no echo behind. From the bridge of the Imperial Star Destroyer Relentless, Captain Vero Kest monitored the tactical holo-display in rigid silence. Crimson sensor spheres flickered where outer rim agri-worlds should have pulsed with traffic. Supply convoys had vanished. Mining colonies failed to report. Even pirate transmissions, normally impossible to silence, had ceased. Signal buoys are intact, an officer reported. No signs of attack debris. No wreckage fields. Admiral Gorin leaned forward, gloved hands clasped behind his back. Then where are the ships? No one answered. The Empire did not tolerate mysteries. It eliminated them. A probe droid deployment was authorized. The chrome spheres launched from the destroyer's ventral bay, vanishing into the velvet darkness toward the silent world designated Virex 9, an agricultural colony known for protein yield vats and atmospheric processors. 200,000 Imperial citizens. A stable supply node. Unremarkable. Loyal. The probe's transmission returned 3 minutes later. At first, the feed appeared corrupted. The image drowned in dark, fibrous shapes that crawled across the sensor lens like living shadows. Atmospheric density readings fluctuated wildly. Biosignature counts exceeded projection models by thousands of %. Then the clouds parted. Where Virex 9's continents had once displayed cultivated grids and irrigation canals, the surface was now coated in pulsating organic matter. Veins of dark purple biomass stretched for hundreds of kilometers, branching like diseased arteries. Towering growths pierced the cloud layer, ribbed spires that exhaled vapor into the atmosphere. Entire seas were coated in slick, membranous film. The probe descended. Movement rippled across the surface. Thousands of small shapes skittered across the living terrain, their motion synchronized and predatory. Larger organisms lumbered between the fleshy ridges, armored and bladed. Something vast shifted beneath the surface, bulging the ground upward before subsiding like a submerged Leviathan. Life signs, the sensor officer whispered, voice tight. Millions. No billions. The probe feed cut to static. A moment later, a final image flickered through, a hooked, bone-white appendage striking the lens. Transmission terminated. Silence returned to the bridge, but it felt different now, not empty, but occupied by something unseen and advancing. Admiral Gorin spoke at last. Prepare a reconnaissance strike team. Below the destroyer's hangar deck, stormtroopers assembled in precise formation. Their armor gleamed under cold lighting, their blaster rifles calibrated for atmospheric engagement. They were veterans of insurrections and pirate purges, trained to impose order upon chaos. Order was the Empire's natural state. Dropships descended through Virex 9's thickened cloud cover, engines roaring against turbulent atmospheric resistance. The troopers expected the sterile scent of fertilizer vats and hydroponic farms. Instead, a sour organic stench filled the troop bay, wet, fungal, and unmistakably alive. Lieutenant Rax tightened his grip on his E-11 blaster. Visors to environmental filtration. The ramp lowered. They stepped into a world that breathed. The ground beneath their boots pulsed faintly, its texture spongy and veined. Organic tendrils clung to ruined farm structures, dissolving durasteel into fibrous growth. Air processors lay half-consumed by dark tissue, their metallic skeletons protruding from swollen masses of living matter. The troopers advanced in tight formation. Motion erupted from the biomass. Small, blade-limbed creatures burst from beneath the surface with shrieking cries, their chitinous bodies glistening with acidic secretions. Blaster fire erupted instantly, red bolts tearing through the swarm. Creatures exploded into viscous spray, yet more poured forward. Relentless and coordinated. Contact. Swarm hostiles. Rack shouted. A larger organism lunged into view, towering, plated, its side-like limbs cleaving through a trooper line before concentrated fire brought it crashing down. The air filled with screeches, blaster fire, and the wet tearing of organic matter. Above them, the sky darkened. Winged shapes circled through the cloud layer, sinewed forms beating the air with membranous wings. One descended, spitting globules of corrosive biomatter that hissed against plastoid armor and burned through plating. Fall back to LZ. Fall back. The troopers fought their way to the dropships, the ground itself writhing as tendrils attempted to ensnare their legs. Engines roared as the transports lifted, narrowly escaping the grasping biomass below. From orbit, the relentless opened fire. Turbolaser batteries lanced downward, incinerating vast swaths of organic terrain. Entire biomass ridges ignited, vaporizing into steaming craters. For several seconds, it appeared effective. Then the surface began to move again. Organic matter flowed inward from surrounding regions, sealing the blast scars as if the planet itself were healing. On the bridge, sensor officers exchanged uneasy glances. Regeneration rate exceeds bombardment efficiency, one reported. The surface is adapting. Admiral Gorin stared at the display, the flickering glow of turbolaser fire reflecting in his eyes. "This is not a rebellion," he said quietly. Captain Kess swallowed. "No, sir." In the medical bay, surviving troopers were decontaminated and scanned. One helmet camera feed replayed the ground footage frame by frame. Biomass growth rates. Coordinated attack patterns. Bioforms adapting to blaster fire. This was not random infestation. This was intelligence. A signal alert chimed across the bridge. Long-range sensors detected movement beyond the outer orbit. Something massive emerged from the darkness between stars, organic in structure, larger than any known capital ship. Its surface pulsed with bioluminescent veins. Smaller organisms drifted around it like parasites orbiting a host. "Unknown vessel configuration," the tactical officer whispered. The shape did not power engines. It pulsed, and the void itself seemed to answer. The object altered course toward the planet below. Admiral Gorin felt a chill settle in his spine, not fear, but the cold recognition that the Empire was no longer the dominant predator in this system. Raise shields. Launch fighters. Alert Sector Command. The Empire had encountered hostile species before. Pirates, insurrectionists, even unknown alien threats. But this was not a species seeking territory. It was a hunger-seeking biomass. And the galaxy was full of it. Across the outer rim, more systems went dark. Freighter captains reported drifting organic debris in hyperspace corridors. Astromech logs recorded strange biosignatures clinging to hull plating after transit. Mining guilds abandoned operations after workers vanished beneath shifting ground. The Imperial Bureau of Information issued containment statements to prevent panic. But fear travels faster than official broadcasts. Whispers spread through trade routes and refugee convoys. Worlds dissolving into living flesh skies black, with winged horror cities swallowed without a scream. On Coruscant, analysts compiled the first threat designation: extragalactic biological entity consumption level hazard. In the deep corridors of Imperial intelligence, a more candid phrase circulated among officers: "It is eating the frontier." If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Beyond the rim, the living fleet descended toward Virex 9, drawn not by conquest, but by consumption. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, countless more were coming. The Relentless held orbit above Virex 9 like a blade poised over infected flesh, its ventral hangers cycling as TIE squadrons launched and returned in tight, nervous rhythms. The turbolaser crews had been ordered to conserve fire, not out of mercy for the colony, now lost beneath pulsating biomass, but because every strike taught the thing below how to endure. The Imperial Navy understood attrition. What it did not understand was an enemy that treated annihilation as education. Admiral Gorin convened his senior staff in the tactical pit, the blue glow of the holo display painting hard lines across their faces. Virex 9 spun beneath them, its night side no longer truly dark. Faint bioluminescent veins pulsed across continents, like a planet-sized heartbeat. Scattered across the orbit were Imperial shuttles and sensor pods, all focused on one grim priority: determine whether this infestation could be isolated, and if it could not, how quickly it could spread. They had already received the first answer in fragments. An ore hauler that had fled the system on a pre-programmed emergency jump reappeared 12 hours later in the neighboring sector, with its transponder still broadcasting. The ship had no crew, no life signs, and no signs of conventional boarding. Its hull plating, however, carried a slick residue that resisted decontamination foam and reacted violently to plasma cutters. When the technicians finally burned it off, the residue writhed like living tissue before it died. The officers in the room watched the holocom footage in silence as the residue hissed and released spores into the air before the filters caught them. Not a contagion, Captain Kess said, voice low. An ecosystem. An ecosystem that uses ships as vectors, Intelligence Officer Marix replied. Her uniform bore the crisp insignia of Imperial Security Bureau liaison, but her eyes were those of someone who had lived too long among secrets. We are not looking at a planetary plague. We are looking at a species with strategic intent. Admiral Gorin's gaze remained fixed on the holo display. The massive organic object they had detected, the first true sign of an extragalactic fleet, had not attacked directly. It had drifted into higher orbit and remained there, as if listening. Smaller bioforms detached from it like flakes from a wound and descended into the atmosphere. Scans suggested they were not landing randomly. They were distributing themselves along the densest regions of biomass, reinforcing hive structures as if responding to a command. Launch a second strike team, Gorin ordered. Different objective. I want samples and a command node, something we can cut out and study. The bridge crew exchanged quick glances, but no one argued. Orders were orders. The Empire demanded answers, and it had always paid for them in blood. This time, the drop did not target abandoned farmland or collapsed processing plants. It targeted a city, what remained of Callanport, a transit hub built around atmospheric shuttles and export barges. From orbit, it appeared as a broken ring of durasteel, drowned beneath creeping purple-black growth. Heat blooms dotted the ruins where the earlier bombardment had ignited organic matter, but the fires had already been smothered by new tissue, suffocating flames beneath wet layers of living flesh. 2 Lambda shuttles descended, escorted by TIE fighters. Their wings cut through the thickened air, engines whining against turbulence. In the troop bay, the stormtroopers were different from the first team. Sealed armor with upgraded filters, flamethrower units among them, and a squad of combat engineers carrying cutting torches and containment canisters. Lieutenant Rax, bruised but alive after the first contact, stood among them as guide and warning. His voice clipped and controlled as he briefed them with the kind of calm that came from staring at death and realizing it had rules. Do not touch the ground without mag seals engaged, he said. Do not remove helmets. If you see fog, spores, or liquid, avoid. If you hear the ground shift, move. The surface is not inert. The shuttle shuddered as it pierced the lower cloud layer, the viewports blurring with condensation and drifting particulate. Through the fog, Callanport emerged like a skeleton half-swallowed by a living sea. The landing pad was visible only because the engineers had targeted it with a precision burn from orbit minutes before. The scorched circle glowed faintly, buying them seconds before the biomass attempted to reclaim it. The ramp lowered. Heat and stench rolled inside like a wave. The troopers stepped out into a landscape of ruin and wet life. The ground around the pad was blistered and cracked, but at the edges, purple-black tissue already crept inward, pulsing in slow, hungry contractions. They moved in disciplined formation, blasters raised, flamethrowers ready, engineers scanning for structural entry points. Every step triggered subtle vibrations beneath their boots, as if the surface registered their presence and filed it away. Inside the ruined city, durasteel towers leaned at odd angles, their foundations dissolved into fibrous growth. Signs in basic hung like dead skin from girders. The streets were choked with organic ridges that resemble veins, and between them, countless small holes opened and closed, breathing. Steam rose from fissures where biomass consumed metal and exhaled chemical vapor in return. A low hum vibrated through everything, not mechanical, not electrical, biological, like a distant chorus of insects amplified to city scale. A trooper near the front paused and aimed his scanner at the wall of a collapsed customs building. Movement behind the structure, he reported. Lieutenant Rax signaled for the squad to halt. The engineers moved forward, their cutting torches hissing, as they carved an entry into the wall. The smell intensified as they cut. The building's interior had been converted into a chamber of slick membranes and hardened chitin. The architecture was no longer Imperial. It was something else, built within the carcass of a city. They entered single file. The inside was darker than expected. Their helmet lamps illuminated surfaces that glistened like wet stone, but when the light passed, the surfaces contracted as if irritated. Thin strands hung from the ceiling like tendons. Some quivered gently, responding to their heat. A trooper brushed one by accident, and the strand recoiled, then latched to his forearm plate with a wet snap. He cursed, tried to pull free, and the strand tightened, pulling as if it had muscle. Flame washed over it, severing the strand. It writhed on the floor for a moment before going still, leaving a smear that hissed against plastoid. Everything here reacts, Rax warned. Even the walls. They pushed deeper, guided by the engineer scanners, toward what looked, structurally, like a central hub, the old city power station, now buried beneath organic mass. The holo display from orbit had identified elevated biothermal activity there, something big. As they approached, the hum grew stronger. It wasn't sound alone. It crawled into their bones. Through the membranes and chitin, a new sensation bled into their awareness. Pressure, like being watched by a gaze that did not require eyes. At the threshold of the power station, they found the first sign of the colony's end beyond the biomass itself. Shapes embedded in the walls. Human forms, half dissolved. Their outlines fused into the living structure, as if the building had grown around them. Faces were distorted, mouths open, eyes sealed under film. Some still wore work uniforms. Others wore civilian clothing. All were part of the architecture now. One of the troopers hesitated, a breath catching in his throat. They're alive. The scanner said no. The shape of the bodies said something else. Not alive, not dead, processed. Used. Rax forced himself forward. Keep moving. They entered the station. At the center of the chamber, where the main reactor core had once stood, a growth rose like a throne made of bone and sinew. Thick cables, organic, not metallic, ran from it into the walls, the ceiling, the floor, connecting it to everything. The growth pulsed with slow certainty, and each pulse sent ripples across the membrane surfaces around them. The air tasted metallic, and their helmet filters flagged unknown particulate at levels that would have killed them in seconds without sealing. The engineers approached carefully, containment canisters ready. They needed a piece of the structure, a sample of the core. The flamethrower troopers formed a protective ring, weapons raised. Then the throne moved, not shifting like an animal, unfolding like an idea becoming physical. The structure peeled back, revealing an inner mass of translucent tissue. Within it, something like a brain throbbed, threaded with veins of bioluminescence. It was not a creature in the way the troopers understood creatures. It was a node, a thinking organ plugged into a planetary body. The hum changed. It sharpened. The pressure in their skulls increased, as if the air had become heavier. A trooper screamed and dropped to one knee, clutching his helmet. Something's in. His voice became static as his comm channel spiked with interference. The others staggered, helmet readouts flickering, as if the node was broadcasting on frequencies their equipment couldn't isolate. The chamber lights on their armor dimmed and brightened in irregular bursts. Maintain formation. Racks barked, fighting dizziness. Flammers burn it. The flamethrowers roared, washing the node in fire. The translucent tissue blackened and bubbled, releasing thick smoke. The brain-like mass convulsed, and for a moment, the hum faltered like a song interrupted. Then the walls opened. Panels of membrane split apart like mouths. From the gaps poured zerglings in waves, their claws clicking against chitin floors as they flooded the chamber. Hydralisk forms followed, taller and more deliberate, their spines rising like spears. Blaster fire erupted. Flames swept across the first wave, turning bodies into smoking husks. The troopers held their line, disciplined, brutal, efficient. Yet each time a zergling fell, another climbed over it, and the floor beneath the corpses seemed to absorb them, drinking the biomass back into itself. Back to the exit. Rax shouted, "Engineers, take what you can." An engineer lunged toward the node with a torch and saw, cutting into the outer tissue. The node shuddered, and the engineer's torch sputtered as if starved of oxygen. He slammed the torch against the tissue again, carving out a chunk, shoving it into a containment canister. The sample inside writhed immediately, pushing against the transparent walls. The canister's seals flashed warnings. "Sample secured," the engineer yelled. The troopers began to retreat, firing as they moved, flame units covering their backs. Hydralisks spat volleys of barbed projectiles that punched into armor, pinning troopers to walls. One fell, his chest plate ruptured, and the barbs continued to move, crawling like parasites into the gap. He screamed until his comm channel cut out. Another trooper tried to pull him free and was dragged down by zerglings, swallowed beneath a surge of claws. They fought their way through the corridor, the city beyond now alive with movement. The low hum had become a roar. Above the ruins, winged shapes descended in flocks, casting shifting shadows across streets that no longer belonged to the Empire or to the colonists, but to the swarm. As they reached the landing zone, they found it shrinking. The scorched circle was nearly closed. Purple-black tissue had flowed inward, reclaiming the pad with obscene determination. The shuttles hovered rather than landed, ramps extending into the air as troopers leapt and grabbed for purchase. Rax climbed last, turning back as he reached the ramp's edge. The biomass below rippled, and for a moment he saw a bulge rise beneath it, a massive shape pressing upward as if something vast was crawling toward the surface. The bulge moved with direction, not random motion. It was coming to meet them. The shuttle engines screamed, lifting hard. TIE fighters strafed the surface, blaster cannons cutting into the swarm. The Lambda shuttles punched through the clouds and broke into orbit, docking with the Relentless under a tight shield envelope. In the containment lab, the sample was sealed inside layered energy fields. The technicians watched it with a mixture of revulsion and awe. Under magnification, the tissue pulsed, its cells reorganizing even as the field tried to freeze it. It wasn't merely alive. It was trying to learn, attempting replication. A technician muttered. "It's responding to containment. Can it be killed?" Captain Kest asked. The technician hesitated. "Not with standard sterilization. It adapts too fast." Admiral Gorin stood behind the glass, hands clasped behind his back. He watched the sample thrash within its prison, and in its movement he imagined the planet below, the systems beyond, the widening map of silence. "This is not a local infestation," he said, voice like cold iron. "It is a spearhead." Marix, the ISB liaison, leaned closer, eyes narrowed. "Then there is a command behind it." Gorin's gaze shifted to the holodisplay, where the massive organic object in orbit above Virex 9 still drifted, unhurried. A Leviathan made of flesh and purpose. It did not flee bombardment. It did not attack in anger. It simply remained, as if waiting for its harvest to mature. "Transmit priority warning to Sector Command," Gorin ordered. "Declare quarantine. Seal hyperspace routes. No ship leaves without sterilization and authorization." Captain Kest hesitated. "Sir, if it's already using ships as vectors." Gorin cut him off. "Then we close the door and burn everything outside it." The command rippled outward, but the Empire was vast, and space was larger still. Even as Gorin issued quarantine protocols, other captains in other sectors were already making decisions in ignorance. Smugglers ran cargo from the Rim without understanding what clung to their hulls. Refugee ships fled silent worlds carrying more than frightened families. Imperial governors buried reports to avoid blame. Huts paid for secrets and sold passage anyway. In a private chamber deep within the Relentless, the recovered helmet footage from Callan Port replayed again. Not the battle, not the screams. The moment the node unfolded, the moment the pressure in the air became thought. The analysts watched that frame by frame, searching for patterns. One of them, pale and trembling, whispered what the others had begun to suspect, but dared not say aloud. It felt like a mind. Marix's expression didn't change, but her voice lowered. Not a mind like ours. A mind like a swarm. Outside the viewport, Virex 9 continued to pulse, healing from every wound, growing with every kill, learning from every attempt to stop it. And in the dark beyond, long-range sensors picked up a new set of faint, irregular returns. Biosignatures moving through interstellar space, far beyond the system. Not one, many. A migrating hunger. On Coruscant. The Emperor's advisors would soon receive the first comprehensive report. On distant rebel safehouses, intercepted transmissions would spark panic and speculation. In forgotten temples, the last Jedi would feel a disturbance that was not rage, not sorrow, but the sudden, unnatural quiet where life should have been singing. The swarm had taken its first world in the Star Wars galaxy, and it had tasted enough to know it wanted the rest. The first official designation transmitted from the Imperial Navy to High Command described the threat in sterile, precise language. Extraterrestrial bioorganisms, exhibiting vacuum survivability and coordinated swarm intelligence. The phrasing was deliberately clinical, intended to contain fear within the boundaries of procedure. Yet across the bridge of the Relentless, the officers watching the tactical displays understood that language was failing to contain what they were witnessing. The organism in high orbit above Virex 9 had not retreated. It had grown. Over the course of 6 standard hours, long-range sensors recorded the arrival of additional organic signatures emerging from the darkness beyond the system's gravity well. They did not translate from hyperspace. They did not accelerate using detectable propulsion. They pulsed into existence at the edge of sensor range, vast shapes drifting inward with a slow inevitability that suggested patience rather than urgency. Their surfaces glowed faintly with bioluminescent veins, like embers moving beneath translucent flesh. Captain Kest watched the returns populate the display. Multiple contacts. Mass readings equivalent to heavy cruisers, some larger. Admiral Gorin did not look away from the viewport. They are reinforcing. Below, Virex 9's continents continued their transformation. Where bombardment had scorched the biomass, new growth spread in radiating patterns, knitting together burned craters into dark, pulsing terrain. Spore plumes vented into the upper atmosphere, forming cloud layers that distorted sensor readings and reflected turbolaser energy in unpredictable ways. The planet was not merely infested. It was being converted. A proximity alert sounded. Smaller organic forms detached from the orbiting Leviathan and drifted outward into the vacuum. At first they appeared inert, tumbling shapes like debris. Then they unfolded. Membranous wings extended, catching solar radiation. Gas bladders expanded and contracted, adjusting trajectory. Spines along their backs flexed, emitting faint bursts of ionized vapor. "They're maneuvering," the tactical officer whispered. "Without engines." The first of them accelerated. "Launch fighter screen," Gorin ordered. "Maintain perimeter. No contact until we understand their capabilities." The TIE squadrons launched in disciplined waves, black silhouettes slicing across the starlight. Their engines screamed in the vacuum, ion trails carving sharp lines through the darkness. The pilots were among the Empire's finest, trained to eliminate pyrocraft, rebel fighters, and unknown alien vessels. None had ever engaged a living war organism. Contact range in 10 seconds, came the calm voice of Squadron Leader Ven over comms. Targets resemble biological mantiforms. No visible weapons. The lead bioform convulsed. Its carapace split along hidden seams. Barbed spines unfolded forward, glowing faintly with internal bioluminescence. The organism flexed and released a spray of crystalline projectiles that glittered in the starlight like a cloud of razors. Evasive. Ven shouted. The TIE formation broke apart as the projectiles streaked through vacuum at lethal velocity. One fighter was struck along its solar array. The panel disintegrated into fragments, and the craft spun out of control before venting atmosphere and going dark. Another projectile punctured a cockpit viewport, flash freezing the pilot before the fighter drifted lifelessly away. Return fire. Green laser bolts lanced through the void, striking the bioforms. The first organism shuddered under repeated hits, its flesh blistering and boiling. It convulsed, ruptured, and burst into drifting fragments. The fragments continued moving. Each piece twitched, propelled by residual muscular contractions. Some struck nearby fighters, clinging briefly before freezing in the vacuum. Others drifted toward the destroyer, leaving faint trails of particulate residue. Debris is biologically active, the sensor officer reported, voice tight. Recommend shield reinforcement. More bioforms advanced, their movement coordinated despite lacking visible communication signals. They spread outward, forming a loose lattice around the Star Destroyer and its fighter screen. From orbit, the Leviathan pulsed, and each pulse corresponded to subtle shifts in the swarm's formation. They're testing us, Captain Kest murmured. A second wave detached from a Leviathan, larger organisms this time, armored with layered plates that resembled overlapping bone. Their ventral surfaces opened to reveal clusters of nodules that glowed with chemical energy. Energy signatures rising, the tactical officer warned. The nodules erupted. Globules of viscous biomatter streaked toward the TIE fighters, trailing vapor that crystallized into ice shards as it froze. One globule struck a fighter wing, splattering across the panel before rapidly expanding, hardening into a jagged mass that locked the solar array in place. The fighter lost maneuverability and drifted helplessly into another projectile burst. Maintain distance. Ven ordered. They're attempting entanglement. The Empire had faced unknown weapons before. It adapted. It countered. But the organisms were adapting as well. Laser strikes that had ruptured earlier bioforms now produced only surface scorching. Their carapaces thickened in real time, layers shifting to disperse energy. Recommend heavy weapons deployment, the tactical officer said. Gorin gave a curt nod. Deploy point defense turrets. The Star Destroyer's surface batteries activated, unleashing a web of laser fire that tore through the swarm. Bioforms detonated in bursts of frozen ichor. Others twisted aside with surprising agility, adjusting their trajectory to exploit gaps in the firing arcs. One organism slammed directly into the destroyer's forward shields. The shield envelope flared bright blue as the creature flattened against it, its spine scraping across the energy barrier. The organism convulsed, then ruptured, releasing a cloud of spores that splattered harmlessly against the shield. For a moment, then the spores began to glow. Unknown reaction on shield surface, a technician reported. Energy absorption detected. The spores clung to the shield envelope, forming a faint web of bioluminescent filaments. The energy readouts fluctuated as if the shield were being leached. Disperse them, Gorin snapped. Point defense lasers swept across the envelope, burning the spores away. The shield stabilized, but the display readings left no doubt. The swarm had learned something. Outside the engagement perimeter, the orbiting Leviathan rotated slowly, its vast surface rippling like muscle beneath skin. From its dorsal ridges, new organisms emerged continuously, drifting into formation. It did not attack directly. It observed, deployed, adapted. Admiral, Marix said quietly from behind him. This is not random evolution. This is tactical learning. Goran's jaw tightened. Then we teach it fear. He turned to the gunnery chief. Target the primary organism. Full turbolaser barrage. The order rippled through the destroyer systems. Turbolaser batteries aligned, their capacitors building charge. The Leviathan filled the forward viewport now, a continent of flesh suspended in vacuum. Fire. Twin lances of green energy struck the Leviathan's surface, followed by a coordinated barrage from the destroyer's dorsal and ventral batteries. The beams carved molten trenches across its hide, vaporizing tissue and sending chunks of organic matter spinning into space. For a heartbeat, the creature appeared to recoil. Then the wounds began to close. Translucent membranes spread across the trenches, sealing them with wet efficiency. Internal tissue shifted, redistributing mass to reinforce damaged regions. The Leviathan did not retreat. It endured. Regeneration rate is accelerating, the sensor officer whispered. As the barrage continued, the Leviathan pulsed again, brighter this time. The surrounding swarm responded instantly, diving toward the destroyer in coordinated attack patterns. The smaller bioforms targeted point defense turrets, clogging firing ports with their bodies. Larger organisms closed on the shield envelope, striking in synchronized waves designed to test frequency tolerances. Shields holding at 87%, the tactical officer reported, but they're adjusting impact vectors. Inside the fighter cockpit, Squadron Leader Ven watched the swarm reorganize with cold clarity. They're not retreating from a destroyer. They're studying it. A bioform lunged at his fighter. He rolled hard, laser fire slicing it in half. The halves drifted apart, and the rear section spasmed, releasing a spray of microspines that peppered his cockpit glass. Warning lights flared as sensors registered surface penetration attempts. Ven cursed and accelerated away, heart hammering. These things were not ships. They were weapons that changed themselves mid-battle. On the Relentless, Goran watched the tactical display as new contacts appeared beyond the system edge. Faint at first, then unmistakable. More Leviathans. How many, he asked. The sensor officer swallowed. At least 6 additional capital-scale organisms entering sensor range. Trajectory suggests convergence. Silence pressed down on the bridge. The Empire had not yet lost a major engagement. The destroyer remained operational. The swarm had taken losses. But the pattern unfolding before them was clear. This was not a raid. It was not a probe. It was an advance wave. The Leviathan below them pulsed once more, and the swarm withdrew slightly, maintaining distance. Not retreating. Repositioning. Admiral, Marek said, her voice lower now. It's not trying to destroy us. Goran's eyes narrowed. Explain. It's measuring us. Learning our capabilities. Determining what it must become to defeat us. Across the bridge, the low hum of systems and distant weapon fire continued, but something colder had entered the air. Not fear. Recognition. The Empire had encountered an enemy that did not rage, did not threaten, did not negotiate. It adapted. Goran turned back to the viewport, watching the Leviathan drift in patient orbit above the devoured world. Its bioluminescent veins pulsed in slow rhythms, like the heartbeat of something vast and ancient. Transmit updated threat assessment to High Command, he ordered. Priority Alpha. Recommend immediate system isolation and fleet mobilization. Captain Kest hesitated only a fraction of a second. Yes, Admiral. Beyond the viewport, the swarm shifted again, forming a loose perimeter around the planet. They were not defending territory. They were guarding a harvest. And beyond the system's edge, the darkness continued to stir as more living vessels emerged from the void between galaxies, drawn by a signal older than war and simpler than conquest. The Star Destroyer held its ground above Virex, 9 shield generators humming under strain, turbolasers tracking drifting organisms that refused to behave like machines. For the first time since the Clone Wars, the Empire faced an adversary that could not be intimidated, bribed, or ruled. Below, the planet pulsed with alien life. Above, the swarm multiplied. And somewhere within the vast neural chorus, connecting the Leviathans and the crawling surface below, the Star Wars galaxy had been recognized as a viable ecosystem. The consumption had begun. News of the Outer Rim silence did not spread through official channels first. It spread the way panic always did in a galaxy stitched together by smugglers, merchant captains, and desperate people who trusted rumor more than Imperial proclamations. The Empire could censor holonet broadcasts on Coruscant, could arrest propagandists in the core, could even erase the names of worlds from navigation logs, but it could not stop a frightened spacer from leaning close in a cantina and saying the words that made every pilot glance toward the nearest exit. They're eating planets. In a battered listening post hidden in the broken spine of an asteroid field, a Rebel Signals crew intercepted fragments of the relentless transmission bursts, tactical packets too dense for casual decoding, but heavy with urgency. Lieutenant Levan, a communications officer who had learned to read Imperial panic in the speed of their encryption cycling, watched the data scroll across her console and felt the cold prickle that came when a war changed shape. Imperial quarantine declaration, she murmured. Multiple systems. Route closures. Sterilization protocols. They don't do that unless something has slipped containment. Across the cramped command module, Captain Ordo Nesh, former merchantman turned rebel logistics leader, ran a hand down his jaw and stared at the holomap. The rimward sectors flickered red where hyperlanes were closing. Refugee vectors drifted like nervous insects toward the mid-rim. What's the cause? He asked. Sela hesitated, then spoke the phrase that had already begun to circulate in whispers among the astromechs and slicers. Extraterrestrial biological entity. Consumption hazard. Ordo barked a humorless laugh. That's not a cause. That's a nightmare they're trying to describe with paperwork. A new transmission pinged, half-garbled, carrying the unmistakable distress format of civilian channels. A freighter captain's voice cracked through the static, shouting coordinates and begging for escort. The message ended in screaming in a wet, distorted roar that did not sound like any language in the galaxy. Sela killed the audio quickly. The room stayed silent for a beat, then filled with the hum of machinery and the faint metallic smell of recycled air. Ordo's gaze hardened. How many civilian ships are already running from those sectors? Too many, Sela said. They'll head for the same choke points, the same ports, if this thing travels with them. Ordo didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. The Rebel Alliance survived on mobility and sympathetic worlds. A plague that rode refugee ships could burn their hidden networks down without firing a blaster. Still, the next decision was not even a decision. It was instinct. Get me evac vectors, Ordo ordered. We move people out before the Empire decides the cleanest solution is to vaporize them. In the mid-rim, on the trade world of Niter Prime, Port Eris stood as a steel and stone labyrinth of docking towers, fuel tanks, and cargo cranes. It was no rebel haven. It was a neutral commercial artery, one of those rare ports that could bribe the Empire enough to avoid heavy garrisoning while still doing business with smugglers and syndicates. On a normal day, Port Eris smelled of coolant and spice, and its air thrummed with the constant rumble of repulsor lifts hauling cargo between ships. On this day, the port smelled like fear. Refugee ships arrived in waves. Bulk freighters packed beyond safety limits, private yachts carrying screaming nobles, mining barges filled with exhausted laborers. They poured down gangplanks with hollow-eyed urgency, dragging what they could carry, leaving the rest behind. Port authorities tried to impose order, but order was fragile in the face of 1,000 stories of worlds that had gone silent overnight. A rumor could start a stampede with a single sentence. "They're coming," someone shouted in the crowd, and bodies surged in a desperate tide toward the departure queues. In a dim corner of docking Bay 19, Rebel Cell operated under false transponder codes. They had bribed the portmaster, hijacked a fuel line, and disguised their transport as a corporate courier ship. Their real purpose was far more dangerous. Evacuate as many civilians as possible from the rimward sectors before Imperial quarantine turned into orbital fire. Captain Ordo strode through the bay, cloak drawn tight, flanked by 2 armed operatives. His crew worked fast, loading refugees into the transport's hold, distributing ration packs, tagging families for separation prevention. This was not heroic spectacle. It was logistics under pressure, the kind that kept people alive. A child clung to his mother's sleeve, staring up at Ordo's insignia-less uniform. "Are you soldiers?" the child asked. Ordo knelt, forcing his voice softer than the metallic echo of the bay. "We're pilots," he said. "We'll get you somewhere safe." The mother's eyes were raw from crying. "The Empire said stay where we were," she whispered. "They said relief ships were coming." Ordo's jaw tightened. "The Empire says a lot of things." Above them, the port's public holoscreens flickered to life. A smooth Imperial announcer appeared, voice calm and authoritative, declaring a temporary travel restriction due to biohazard risk, and urging all citizens to remain calm. The crowd's murmur rose into angry shouts. Refugees didn't trust calm voices anymore. Calm voices were what came before people vanished. Sila's calm unit crackled in Ordo's ear. "Captain, incoming Imperial Customs corvette. They're scanning all outbound vessels." Ordo looked up sharply. An Imperial corvette slid into port approach. Its hull painted the pale gray of authority. TIE fighters accompanied it, their silhouettes cutting across the skyline like knives. "Time?" Ordo asked. "Minutes," Sila replied. Ordo's mind ran through options. If customs boarded, the evac was over. If they tried to fight, they'd trigger an Imperial lockdown. If they fled early, they'd leave hundreds behind. He made the morally complex choice the war demanded. He stayed. "Load faster," he ordered. "No panic. Keep lines moving." His operatives obeyed, forcing calm into their gestures, making themselves anchors in the storm. Refugees filed into the hold in dense clusters. The transport's engines began to warm, humming low, the smell of fuel thickening the air. Then the first scream echoed from outside the bay. It wasn't the scream of a pickpocket caught or a brawl breaking out. It was the scream of someone seeing something impossible. Ordo pushed through the bay doors into the open concourse and felt the atmosphere shift. People were running now, not toward ships, but away from something crawling across the far end of the docking complex. At first, he thought it was a riot, bodies moving in chaotic patterns. Then he saw the shapes. Small, fast, bladed creatures skittered across the durasteel floor, their claws sparking as they moved. They moved with purpose, not frenzy, weaving between fleeing bodies as if selecting targets. Behind them, the ground itself looked wrong, dark patches spreading across the polished metal like oil, but thicker, textured, pulsing faintly. Creep. His stomach dropped. "They're here," he breathed. Somehow, a ship had brought it. A port security team opened fire. Blaster bolts tore through the first wave of creatures. The creatures fell, shredded, but their bodies burst into wet spray that splattered across the floor. Where it landed, the dark patches expanded, feeding. The port's air filled with a faint mist, and people began coughing, choking, eyes watering as spores spread in the confined space. Ordo snapped his comm unit open. "Sila, seal the bay. Now." Sila's voice came back tight with fear. "If we seal, we trap people outside." Ordo glanced at the stampeding crowd. He saw families. He saw workers. He saw a security guard trying to pull a child to safety. He also saw the creep spreading, saw the Zerglings cutting through fleeing civilians with terrifying efficiency. He made another choice, colder than the first. "Seal it," he said. "We lose everyone if the infestation gets inside." The bay doors slammed shut, hydraulic locks engaging. On the other side, fists pounded, screams rose. And then the screams became wet and abrupt as the swarm reached them. Inside the bay, silence fell for half a heartbeat before the refugees began to realize what had happened. Some shouted, some begged, some tried to force the doors. Ordo stood in the middle of it, his hands clenched so hard his knuckles ached. He would remember those screams for the rest of his life. He would also remember why he did it. Because if the creep reached the transport, it would carry the infestation to every safe world they fled toward. Sila appeared from the cockpit ladder, face pale. "Engines are ready." But the customs corvette is still inbound. They'll see us launch. Ordo's gaze shifted to the port skyline. The Imperial corvette had begun firing into the concourse, its turrets shredding parts of the docking complex to contain the outbreak. Stormtroopers poured from its ramp, flamethrower units among them, burning back creep with harsh orange flame. The Empire's response was immediate and ruthless. Containment by destruction. But even Imperial firepower couldn't erase the fact that the infestation had reached a populated trade hub. A hub connected to hundreds of routes. Ordo turned to his crew. "We launch under their noses," he said. "If they chase, we jump." Sila's mouth tightened. "We don't have clearance." "We don't need it," Ordo replied. The transport's repulsor lifts engaged, rising off the deck. Refugees clung to handholds, eyes wide, some praying, some sobbing. Outside, alarms wailed across Port Eris. The sky filled with TIE fighters. Smoke rose from burning docks. In the distance, Ordo could see the creep already climbing the sides of cargo towers, like a living shadow reaching upward. The transport lifted into the open air and accelerated toward the upper atmosphere. Immediately, an Imperial Customs hail pinged their comm channel, demanding identification and docking authorization. Ordo ignored it. A warning shot streaked past their bow, green bolts from a TIE patrol. The transport's shields flared. "Shields at 60%, Sila called. Ordo's pilot angled them hard, using the port's superstructure as cover. The transport skimmed between two docking towers as blaster fire lit the air around them. In the rear viewport, he saw civilians pressed against the glass, staring down at the burning port, the spreading shadow of creep, the flicker of stormtrooper flamethrowers fighting a battle they were not meant to fight. "Coordinates locked," Sila said, hands flying over controls. "But hyperspace calculations are." The ship shuddered as something struck the hull. Not a laser. A physical impact. A scraping sound vibrated through the frame. "Contact on the dorsal plating," a crewman shouted. Ordo's blood ran cold. "No, not on my ship." A shadow slid across the cockpit viewport. Something clung to their hull, its limbs hooked into plating seams. Another followed, then another. Zerglings that had launched themselves onto the transport as it lifted, carried upward like parasites riding prey. Ordo grabbed a blaster and sprinted for the access hatch leading to the dorsal corridor. His operatives followed, weapons ready. He didn't have time to think about heroism. He had time to prevent contagion. They opened the hatch. The corridor above was already damaged. Claw marks gouged through bulkheads. A Zergling hissed and lunged, jaws wide. Ordo fired point blank, the creature exploding into wet gore. The gore splattered across the wall, sizzling as it reacted with heated metal. And Ordo realized with horror that even killing it created risk. "Flame unit," he shouted. One of his operatives unleashed a focused burst from a compact incinerator, burning the residue away before it could spread. The corridor filled with smoke and the acrid smell of charred flesh. More Zerglings crawled through vents, their claws clicking. Ordo's crew fought in tight quarters, blasters and flame working together, each kill followed by immediate sterilization. It was brutal, exhausting, and painfully slow. Behind them, the ship shook again as the pilot fought to evade TIE fire. Alarm lights flashed red. Somewhere below, refugees screamed as the ship jolted. Sila's voice came over comms, strained. "We cannot stay in atmosphere. We jump now, or we die here." Ordo fired again, dropping another creature, then watched a smear of living residue attempt to crawl across the floor like a dying insect. He burned it until the metal glowed. "Jump," he ordered, voice raw. "Jump now." The transport shuddered, engines whining as the hyperdrive spooled despite incomplete clearance. Stars stretched into lines. The ship tore itself free of real space and vanished into hyperspace, carrying hundreds of refugees, and, Ordo prayed, nothing else. He stood in the smoke-filled corridor, chest heaving, staring at the scorched floor. He had saved lives. He had also sealed the door on others. And he had learned the cruelest truth of this new war. The Swarm did not need fleets to conquer worlds. It needed one mistake, Behind them, Port Eris burned under Imperial quarantine fire. And the creep spread anyway, crawling through the bones of commerce like a living curse. Ahead of them, hyperspace howled, and somewhere in the vastness between stars, the swarm listened, learned, and followed the scent of life. Hyperspace offered no comfort to those who fled into it. The swirling blue corridor had always represented escape, distance, possibility, survival purchased by speed. Now it carried a new dread. Every vibration through the hull made passengers flinch. Every fluctuation in engine pitch felt like the prelude to catastrophe. The refugees packed into the transport's hold sat in stunned silence, clutching one another, while the air recyclers struggled to keep pace with fear-thickened breath and the lingering smell of smoke. Captain Ordo Nesh remained in the dorsal corridor long after the last Zergling carcass had been incinerated and the metal plating cooled from a dull glow back to gray. He watched the scorched deck as if expecting it to move again. The crew had performed 3 sterilization sweeps. Thermal scans showed no biological residue. Atmospheric filters registered clean. Still, he did not leave. He had seen how quickly the swarm turned the smallest trace into a foothold. Sela then approached quietly, her boots echoing softly in the corridor. "Hull integrity stable," she reported. "Environmental readings normal. We're clean." Ordo didn't look up immediately. "Normal is a luxury," he said. Then he exhaled and straightened. "Where are we headed?" "Prearranged fallback point in the mid-rim," she said. "From there, refugee distribution routes. Assuming the Empire hasn't sealed them yet." He nodded once. Survival now meant outrunning not just the swarms, but Imperial quarantine lines, pirate opportunists, and the panic of systems afraid to receive ships that might carry invisible death. Behind them, in the sealed containment locker near engineering, the remains of one Zergling, burned to near carbon, rested within a triple-layer stasis field. Ordo had insisted on keeping it, despite Sela's objections. Knowledge had become as valuable as fuel. They needed to understand what they were facing. He descended into engineering. Chief Mechanic Tarek had already disassembled portions of the creature's charred exoskeleton under sterile containment. The air inside the chamber smelled faintly of ozone and antiseptic chemicals. Tarek's gloved hands hovered over the specimen with reverence usually reserved for ancient relics. "It's still trying to reorganize," Tarek said without looking up. Ordo felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "It's dead." "It should be," Tarek replied. "But the cellular structure isn't behaving like dead tissue. It's collapsing inward, rearranging into tighter clusters. Like it's conserving itself." On the scanning screen, magnified cellular structures pulsed faintly. Burned edges hardened into crystalline plates. Even charred fragments attempted to reconstitute structural integrity. "Adaptive biology," Sela murmured. "Even in death." Tarek toggled another scan mode. "It gets worse. Look at the protein chains. They're not stable. They're mutating." Ordo leaned closer. "From what?" Tarek pulled up comparative readings. "Trace residues from our hull plating. Carbon composites. Durasteel particulate. It's trying to integrate them." Silence filled the engineering chamber, thick and heavy. It was not merely consuming life. It was learning from what it touched. Ordo straightened slowly. "Jettison it." Tarek hesitated. "Sir, this could be." "Jettison it," Ordo repeated. "We don't carry evolution in our cargo hold." Tarek sealed the specimen in a hardened capsule. Moments later, the cargo lock cycled. The capsule vanished into hyperspace, tumbling into the blue infinity between stars. They stood in silence after it was gone. Even in disposal, they felt as if they had not escaped. 3 sectors away, the Imperial science vessel Veracity drifted in silent orbit over the abandoned research outpost of Rin Vallis. The station had ceased transmission 41 hours earlier. Automated defense satellites remained active, but none responded to hails. The Empire had dispatched the Veracity not to rescue survivors, but to recover data and biological samples. Inside the sterile corridors of the outpost, Imperial xenobiologist Dr. Elia Vort stepped over a collapsed workstation and tried not to breathe through her mouth. The air filtration units were still operational, but a faint organic odor lingered beneath the antiseptic scent, a wet, fungal smell that seemed to cling to the back of her throat. Stormtroopers moved ahead of her, flamethrowers ready, their armor scorched from earlier sterilization sweeps. They had burned growths off the exterior hull before docking. Even so, dark streaks remained etched into the metal like veins. Environmental level stable, the lead trooper reported. No active hostiles. Dr. Vort knew better than to trust absence. The laboratory doors had been sealed from within. When they cut them open, they found the staff inside. Not dead. Not alive. Their bodies were cocooned in fibrous tissue that bound them to walls and consoles like specimens mounted for study. Tubes of translucent organic matter ran from the cocoons into the floor, pulsing faintly. Dr. Vort forced herself forward, recording everything. No signs of trauma, she said. No defensive wounds. This appears to be immobilization for metabolic processing. One cocoon shuddered. The troopers raised their weapons instantly. Dr. Vort held up a hand. Wait. The fibrous membrane trembled, then split open along a seam. A human face emerged, eyes clouded, mouth moving soundlessly. Something shifted beneath the skin, small movements like fish darting beneath water. The troopers hesitated only a moment before flame engulfed the cocoon. The human shape collapsed into ash and blackened residue. The tubes attached to the cocoon recoiled and shriveled. Dr. Vort closed her eyes briefly. Not grief. Calculation. They were alive long enough to be processed, she said quietly. This organism does not merely consume. It harvests. They moved deeper into the outpost, following the faint hum of energy readings. In the central chamber, they found a growth nearly identical to the node recovered on Virex 9, an organic throne threaded into the station's power grid. Cables and conduits had been digested and replaced with living tissue. The station had become an extension of the swarm. Dr. Vort activated her scanner. Energy patterns indicate signal transmission, she said. Not local. Intersystem. Communication, the trooper asked. Coordination, she corrected. The node pulsed once, and the lights in the chamber flickered. A pressure settled behind her eyes, not pain, but presence. She felt the distinct and terrible impression of being observed. Destroy it, the trooper said. She hesitated. Knowledge warred with survival. If they destroyed it, they would slow the spread here. If they studied it, they might understand the intelligence behind the swarm. The node pulsed again, brighter. A low vibration spread through the floor. Decision made itself. Destroy it. Flame roared across the chamber, followed by a thermal charge. The node convulsed as the blast tore through its core. Organic cables snapped and recoiled. The hum died for 6 seconds. Then the walls began to bleed. Small tendrils pushed through seams in the metal. Fibrous tissue expanded across surfaces. The outpost had not been a host. It had become a body. Evacuate, the trooper shouted. They retreated through corridors already shifting, metal panels bulging as growth forced its way through. The station lights dimmed as power rerouted through organic channels. Behind them, the hum returned, faint, but spreading. When the Veracity disengaged from the docking collar and pulled away, the outpost drifted in silence. Then its exterior hull split along multiple seams, organic structures blooming outward into vacuum like grotesque flowers. From those openings, spore clouds drifted into space. In hyperspace, Ordo's transport dropped briefly into real space for recalibration near an uninhabited red dwarf system. The stars reappeared around them, cold and distant. The crew performed another hull scan. Negative contamination, Sela reported. Ordo nodded, but relief refused to come. The memory of Port Eris burned behind his eyes. He stepped into the hold, where refugees sat in dim light, wrapped in blankets, sharing ration packs and silent gratitude. A young boy looked up at him. Are we safe now? He asked. Ordo crouched beside him. He had flown through blockades, outrun pirates, defied Imperial patrols. He had always been able to answer that question with confidence. Now he hesitated. For now, he said. It was the only truth he had left. Above them, the stars burned with indifferent brilliance. Somewhere beyond those lights, the swarm continued its silent expansion, converting worlds into engines of consumption. Each colony absorbed became a factory. Each victim became biomass. Each encounter taught the swarm how to better survive the galaxy that resisted it. On Imperial channels, quarantine lines tightened. On smuggler routes, prices for passage tripled. On Mandalorian holofeeds, contract offers began to circulate. And in the unseen neural chorus, binding Leviathans, hive nodes, and creeping continents, new data flowed. Metallic alloys, atmospheric compositions, neural complexity of native species, energy missions from advanced technology. The swarm did not simply devour. It evolved. Somewhere in the darkness between stars, new bioforms began to take shape. Carapaces thickening against directed energy weapons. Sensory organs attuning to electromagnetic frequencies. Metabolic pathways adjusting to alien biochemistries. The Star Wars galaxy was no longer an unknown ecosystem. It was a blueprint. Across the galaxy, beings accustomed to sensing danger through scanners, intelligence briefings, or military reports were only beginning to grasp the scale of the threat. Yet there existed another kind of awareness, one that did not rely on instruments or transmissions. It was older than the Republic, older than hyperspace travel, older even than the first lightsaber igniting in defense of peace. It was the living force, the invisible current binding all life into a single interwoven song. And that song was faltering. On a wind-carved plateau above the amber deserts of Jedda's outer reaches, a hooded figure knelt among shattered stone pillars, her breath slow and deliberate. The temple ruins had been abandoned long before the Empire seized the holy city, their sanctity stripped and their kyber stores plundered for weapons. Yet some places retained echoes that even conquest could not erase. The force lingered here in faint currents, enough for those attuned to feel its subtle flow. Former Jedi Knight Kaurin Voss closed her eyes and reached into that flow. For years, she had survived by keeping her presence small, masking herself from Imperial inquisitors who hunted survivors of the Purge. She had learned to listen without touching, to observe without drawing attention. But now the silence spreading through the Force was too vast to ignore. At first, it felt like distance, a quiet absence at the edge of perception. Then it deepened, like notes in a symphony abruptly cut away. Entire chords of life vanished, leaving hollow spaces that reverberated with wrongness. Her breathing faltered. This was not the darkness of the Sith. The dark side surged with emotion, anger, fear, hatred, ambition. It roared like a storm. What she felt now was something else entirely. It was absence, consumption, the erasure of voices before they could cry out. She opened her eyes sharply. Far beyond Jedda's sky, worlds were dying. Behind her, soft footsteps approached across the stone. Kaurin did not turn. She had sensed the presence long before the man arrived. He moved with careful restraint, concealing his presence in the Force not through humility, but through disciplined will. "Your distress echoes," said the newcomer, voice smooth and controlled. "You are not subtle." Kaurin rose slowly and faced him. He wore dark robes, travel-worn and practical, not ceremonial. His eyes burned with restrained intensity, and the faint tremor in the air around him revealed the truth he did not speak. "A Sith." "Strange," she said quietly. "I would expect you to savor suffering." He tilted his head slightly. "Suffering feeds passion. Passion feeds power." "This," he paused, as if searching for the correct word. "This is silence." Kaurin studied him. He was not an inquisitor, not a mere agent of Imperial will. He carried the weight of training deeper and older, perhaps once an apprentice cast adrift in the shifting tides of Sith ambition. "You feel it too," she said. He stepped closer to the edge of the plateau, staring into the distance where the desert met the horizon in a shimmering haze. "Entire presences vanish," he said, "not extinguished in rage or conquest. Removed, as if devoured." The wind hissed across the broken pillars, carrying dust and the faint metallic tang of distant Kyber excavation. Kaurin closed her eyes again, reaching carefully into the Force. This time, she extended her perception farther, toward the rimward sectors where Imperial quarantine zones now flickered on navigation charts. The silence there had deepened. Where once she might have sensed the diffuse life of colonies and ecosystems, she felt nothing. Not darkness. Nothing. Her stomach clenched. "This is beyond war," she whispered. The Sith studied her with narrowed eyes. War feeds a force. Death releases energy. Conflict reshapes destiny. But this removes potential. Kaurin's gaze sharpened. "You fear it." "I do not fear," he replied automatically. Then his voice lowered. "I assess." Above them, a transport freighter streaked across the sky, engines flaring as it altered course toward Jeddah City. Even here, in a place stripped of its former sanctity, refugees arrived seeking shelter from rumors spreading across hyperspace lanes. The Force stirred around them, not with the harmony of life, but with agitation, like water disturbed by unseen currents. Kaurin felt it then, a ripple of something unnatural moving through the living Force itself. Not corruption, not domination, displacement. She staggered. Images flooded her awareness. A green world drowned beneath pulsating biomass, skies black with winged shapes, oceans choked with organic film. She felt countless presences extinguished, not with screams, but with abrupt cessation, like lights snapped off in a darkened hall. She gasped and dropped to one knee. The Sith caught her arm before she fell. His grip was firm, steady, practical. No malice. No manipulation. Only urgency. "What did you see?" he demanded. "Consumption," she whispered. "Life being converted." He released her slowly, absorbing the words. "This is not the dark side," he said. "This is not the light. It is something outside the balance." Kaurin looked up at him. The Force binds all living things. If life itself is erased, the Force diminishes. His expression hardened, the implications settling like frost. Power cannot be drawn from absence. For a long moment they stood in silence, enemies by doctrine, witnesses by necessity. Far above, a distant tremor passed through the Force, subtle but unmistakable. Another world falling silent. On a remote jungle moon orbiting a gas giant in the mid-rim, a small enclave of Force-sensitive refugees lived in secrecy among the towering roots of ancient trees. They were not Jedi, not formally trained. They were children and adults who had felt something in themselves and fled Imperial persecution before it could be named. Their leader, an elderly Mirilan named Sareth, paused mid-step along a narrow root bridge and gripped the railing as dizziness struck him. The forest around him thrummed with life. Insects buzzing, leaves whispering, distant calls of unseen creatures echoing through green twilight. Then, for a heartbeat, the forest went quiet. Birdsong ceased. Insects stopped. The wind stilled. The silence lasted less than a second, but its echo lingered in Sareth's mind like a bell struck in the depths of space. He looked up, eyes wide. "Something is devouring the song," he whispered. Around him, the younger sensitives stirred uneasily, glancing toward the sky as if expecting to see the cause descending from the clouds. Deep within the black corridors of the Imperial Palace on Coruscant, Emperor Palpatine sat motionless in his private meditation chamber. The room was silent save for the low hum of distant power conduits and the faint rustle of his robes. His eyes remained closed, but his awareness stretched across the galaxy, probing disturbances in the Force with predatory focus. He had felt wars ignite and fade. He had sensed rebellion stir and be crushed. He knew the texture of fear, ambition, rage, and despair. This disturbance was different. Where life should have echoed, he sensed voids, regions where the Force's resonance weakened, as if its medium were being stripped away. It was not the light resisting him. It was not rival darkness rising. It was absence. His fingers tightened against the armrests of his throne. "Curious," he murmured. A presence approached the chamber threshold, mechanical breathing preceding the figure that knelt just beyond the doorway. "My master," said Darth Vader. Palpatine did not open his eyes. You feel it. Yes, Vader replied. Entire systems grow quiet. The Emperor's thin smile did not reach his eyes. The galaxy faces a predator that consumes not merely bodies, but potential. An enemy that denies both light and dark. Vader's respirator hissed softly. Then, it threatens the balance you have forged. Palpatine's gaze opened at last, yellow eyes gleaming in the dim light. It threatens everything. For the first time in many years, his tone carried something beyond calculation. Interest. On the plateau above Jedda's desert, Kaurin Voss felt the wind return, carrying dust and distant engine noise. She stood slowly, the Sith still watching her with that measured intensity. We cannot face this divided, she said quietly. His expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted. Less guarded, more contemplative. Unity between our orders is myth, he replied. Extinction makes myth irrelevant, she said. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the fading sun cast long shadows across the broken temple stones. Somewhere beyond that horizon, beyond hyperspace lanes and Imperial borders, the Swarm continued its silent feast. Each consumed world diminished the living force, weakening the foundation upon which Jedi discipline and Sith dominance alike depended. For the first time in generations, both light and dark stood before a threat that neither philosophy alone could overcome. The wind whispered through the ruins, and far beyond the stars, another world fell silent. The Mandalorians did not feel the living force falter. They did not meditate on balance or listen for echoes of distant worlds dying. They learned of the Swarm the way warriors always learned of new threats, through rumors of battles, through the smell of credits, through the arrival of refugees who spoke of horrors that could not be bargained with. The first contract appeared in the hidden channels of the Bounty Hunters Guild 3 days after Port Eris burned. It was labeled a containment extermination job, issued not by the Empire, but by a consortium of mid-rim governors terrified their worlds would be next. The payout was obscene. The attached images were worse. Orbital scans of a moon where the surface had begun to pulse in purple-black patterns, and helmet footage of armored soldiers consumed beneath skittering shapes that moved too fast to track. The Mandalorians understood one thing immediately. This was not prey. This was a war. On Mandalore's scattered holonetworks, fractured since the Empire's occupation and the fall of old regimes, clan leaders debated in private halls and on encrypted comms. Some argued it was an Imperial problem and not worth dying for. Others saw opportunity. A threat that even the Empire struggled to contain meant leverage. Contracts meant wealth. Wealth meant weapons. Weapons meant freedom. Clan Kry's remnants did not lead these discussions anymore. Not publicly. What remained of Mandalorian unity existed in small, hardened circles, bound by the old creed. Survival through strength. On the war moon Concordia, beneath a sky the color of bruised iron, Clan Varud convened in an underground forge hall where Beskar was hammered into shape by fire and stubborn will. The air smelled of molten metal and oil. Warriors stood in a ring, their armor scarred, their helmets reflecting forge flame. At the center stood Ral Varud, clan captain, broad-shouldered and calm in the way only those raised in constant conflict could be calm. He listened as his quartermaster projected the contract details onto a flickering holoscreen. Target. Infested moon designated Tartos Minor, the quartermaster said. Local militia collapsed within 12 hours. Empire has not declared quarantine yet. Governors offering payment in refined Beskar stockpiles and ship parts. A low murmur rippled through the hall at the word Beskar. Ralph's voice cut through it. We don't sell ourselves for metal. The quartermaster dipped his head. We sell ourselves for survival. This contract buys our fleet's fuel and our foundry's power. A veteran warrior, helmet under his arm, stepped forward. And if this swarm spreads, there will be no contracts left. No worlds left. Only meat. Ralph's gaze held him. Then we go, he said simply. But we go to learn, not to die. They departed within hours, 3 Mandalorian assault craft, heavy gunships modified for atmospheric and orbital combat, their hulls reinforced with Beskar plating where it mattered most. They carried flamethrowers, thermal detonators, jetpacks, and sonic disruptors designed to shatter bone and armor alike. They did not carry illusions. On the approach to Tartos Minor, the first thing they saw was how wrong the moon looked. From orbit, it should have been gray and cratered, a scarred rock used for minor mining and refueling. Instead, it glowed faintly with purple-black veins. Organic ridges rose from the surface like the backs of buried beasts. Thin cloud layers swirled unnaturally, thick with particulate. Even from this distance, sensor arrays registered biosignatures in numbers that made no sense for a barren moon. Ral watched the display in silence, helmet resting in his hands. He could feel the subtle vibration in the deck beneath his boots as the ship's systems adjusted to anomalous atmospheric density. "Feels like a living thing," his pilot muttered. "That's because it is," Rao replied, and sealed his helmet with a hiss. They descended. The moment their ships breached the cloud layer, spore fog clung to their hulls, leaving streaks of residue that steamed briefly against the heat of their engines. The air smelled of rot and chemicals, like something decomposing and being reborn at the same time. They landed near what used to be a refueling station, now half-swallowed by biomass. The station's Dura-steel towers protruded like broken bones from fleshy ridges. Creep covered the ground in thick carpets, pulsing faintly beneath their boots. Mandalorians stepped out in formation, jetpacks humming softly, flamethrowers held ready. Their helmets filtered air, their visor displays layering thermal scans over the ruined landscape. Movement under the surface, one warrior reported calmly. Ral nodded once. "Let it come." It came fast. Zerglings erupted from the creep in a wave, their claws scraping against Beskar as they slammed into the Mandalorian line. Blaster fire cracked, but the Mandalorians did not rely on blasters alone. Flamethrowers roared, turning the front ranks of Zerglings into shrieking torches. Jetpacks flared as warriors vaulted upward, raining down thermal detonators that detonated with concussive force, ripping open the creep and exposing layers of pulsing tissue beneath. The swarm recoiled, not in fear, but in recalibration. Hydralisks rose from behind the Zergling wave, their spines launching like harpoons. The first volley struck Mandalorian armor and deflected off Beskar plates with sparks, embedding into weaker joints. One warrior staggered as a spine pierced beneath his shoulder guard, but he kept moving, cutting the projectile out with a vibra knife and sealing the wound with a hissed curse. "Beskar holds," he growled. "Keep earning." Ral surged forward, his jetpack carrying him over the Zerglings as he landed atop a ridge of creep. His gauntlet blade snapped out, slicing through a creature's neck. Acidic blood splattered across his armor, hissing faintly before the coating neutralized it. He realized something crucial in that moment. The swarm's tactics here were different from the reports. The Zerglings weren't mindlessly swarming. They were probing, testing armor seams, targeting joints, adjusting. "It's learning," he said over comms, faster than a living thing should learn. His second-in-command, Vexa, responded with grim amusement. "Then we teach it with fire." They advanced toward the refueling station's core chamber, where thermal scans indicated a massive heat source beneath the structure. The hum in the air grew stronger. The creep thickened, becoming almost rubbery underfoot. At the station entrance, they found the remnants of the local militia, bodies fused into the walls, armor half-dissolved, faces frozen beneath translucent film. Mandalorians did not flinch. They had seen death. What unsettled them was how death had been used as architecture. Vex's voice lowered. "This isn't slaughter. It's construction." Ral nodded. "And construction means purpose." Inside, the station's central fuel tanks had been converted into organic sacs, pulsing with chemical fluid. Tubes of living tissue ran through the corridors, replacing pipes. The air vibrated with that same low hum Imperial reports had mentioned, like the heartbeat of a mind too vast to fit inside one skull. Then the core chamber opened before them. A hive structure rose from the center, ribbed and crowned with spines, its surface slick with bioluminescent veins. It was not as large as the Leviathan in orbit above Virex 9, but it carried the same signature, a command node, plugged into the moon's converted ecosystem. Ral stepped forward slowly, visor scanning. "There," he said. "That's the brain." A Mandalorian beside him raised a thermal charge. Ral lifted a hand. "Not yet." He watched the hive node carefully, noting the subtle rhythm of its pulses. Each pulse corresponded to movement in the walls, to faint vibrations in the floor. This was coordination. This was a conductor directing an orchestra of claws and teeth. He wanted to know how quickly it could respond. Ral fired a single blaster bolt into the node. The bolt struck and sizzled, scorching tissue. The node convulsed once, and the chamber filled with sound. Not a roar, not a scream. A chorus of clicking, hissing, and vibrating hum that rose into a unified frequency, vibrating through Mandalorian helmets. Their comm channels crackled as interference spiked. "Contact incoming," Vexa warned. The walls opened again. Not only Zerglings and Hydralisks this time, but a new shape, larger, heavier, plated with thick armor that glistened like obsidian. It lumbered forward with the mass of a siege beast, its tusks curved, its forelimbs thick as durasteel struts. An Ultralisk. Ralph's heart didn't race. Mandalorians did not fear size. They respected it. "Spread," he ordered. "Hit joints. Burn the soft tissue." The Mandalorians moved like a practiced unit, jetpacks flaring as they separated, circling the beast. Blaster fire peppered its armor, sparks flying. Flamethrowers washed across its underbelly, forcing it to shift. Vexa launched a cable from her gauntlet, anchoring it to a ridge in the floor, then fired the other end into the Ultralisk's leg joint. The cable tightened, jerking its movement off balance. Ral vaulted upward and landed on the beast's back, his boots clanging against thick carapace. He slammed a thermal charge into a seam between plates and kicked off, jetpack flaring as he launched away. The charge detonated. The Ultralisk bellowed, the sound vibrating through the chamber like an earthquake. Plates shattered, exposing softer tissue beneath. The Mandalorians poured flame into the wound, burning deep. The beast stumbled, then collapsed, twitching. For a moment, it felt like victory. Then the corpse began to sink. The floor beneath it softened, absorbing the mass. The creep drank it in, pulling it down like quicksand. Within seconds, the Ultralisk was gone, recycled into the hive. Ral stared at the spot where it vanished. "It reclaims everything," he said quietly. Vex's voice came tight. "Then killing it only feeds it." Ral turned back to the hive node, eyes narrowed behind his visor. The node pulsed again, and he felt the same pressure, presence, settle behind his eyes. The swarm was not merely reacting. It was watching. He raised his thermal detonator, thumb hovering over the trigger. If he destroyed the node, he might slow the infestation here. He might save whatever remained of this moon. But he would also lose the opportunity to learn more, to understand how fast the swarm adapted, how it coordinated, what it needed. Outside, his crew would be leaving with Refugee soon. The contract demanded extermination, but Mandalore demanded survival. Ral made his choice. "Plant charges," he ordered. "But we take data first. Record everything. Upload it to clan channels. If we die, the galaxy needs to know how this thing fights." Vexa nodded once. Understood. They moved with ruthless efficiency, attaching thermal charges around the hive node and along key organic conduits. One warrior deployed a probe that drilled into the node's outer tissue, extracting genetic samples into a sealed capsule. Another recorded pulse frequencies and electromagnetic patterns. The node pulsed faster. The walls trembled. It knew what they were doing. "Extraction now," Ral ordered. "Detonate on my mark." They sprinted back through corridors that began to shift, membranes tightening as if trying to seal them in. Zerglings poured from vents, but the Mandalorians cut through them with flame and blade, jetpacks carrying them over grasping tendrils. They reached the surface just as the sky above darkened with winged shapes. Mutalisks descended in a screeching spiral, their bodies slick, their tails flicking as they spat biomatter toward the Mandalorian ships. Board. Ral shouted. They vaulted into their craft, engines roaring. As they lifted, Ral triggered the detonators. The refueling station erupted in fire and concussive blasts. The Hive node convulsed as flames tore through its conduits. The ground buckled, and for a moment, the creep stopped pulsing. Then it began again. Even as the Mandalorian ships climbed toward orbit, their sensors registered new growth spreading from beyond the blast zone, flowing inward to rebuild. Vexus stared at the display, voice flat. We didn't kill it. Ral watched the surface heal like a wound closing. No, he said. We slowed it. Above the moon, the thin curve of space revealed something worse. Organic shapes drifting in the void, small clusters that had not been there earlier. Vacuum-capable bioforms, perhaps drawn by the battle, perhaps summoned. The swarm had tasted Mandalorian fire, and it would adapt to it. Ral's ship turned away from the moon, engines flaring toward hyperspace. He did not feel triumph. He felt the grim clarity of a warrior who had just encountered an enemy that would not stop until there was nothing left to fight over. On his comm channel, he transmitted their data burst to every clan frequency he still trusted. Listen, he said, voice hard. The swarm can be burned. It can be wounded. But it learns faster than any foe we faced. If you take these contracts, bring fire. Bring Beskar. And bring the will to retreat when victory feeds the enemy. The message ended, and the Mandalorian ships vanished into hyperspace, carrying samples, data, and a warning that would ripple across warrior clans and criminal syndicates alike. On Tartos Minor, the creep pulsed again, spreading across scorched craters, rebuilding Hive structures like scars closing over deeper infection. The swarm had not been defeated. It had been introduced to a new predator, and it had begun adapting to hunt it too. The Imperial doctrine for planetary catastrophe had been refined across decades of insurrection, plague containment, and ecological collapse. It was designed to preserve order above all else. When unrest threatened stability, the response was overwhelming force. When disease threatened population centers, the response was isolation and sterilization. When rebellion threatened imperial authority, the response was annihilation. But the swarm did not fit into doctrine. It did not negotiate, did not surrender, did not demand concessions or territory. It consumed and converted, transforming planets into engines of biological expansion. Containment required decisions that even hardened imperial strategists had rarely contemplated. The sacrifice of entire systems not to defeat an enemy, but to slow its spread. On the bridge of the relentless, Admiral Gorin stood before a holo-display now crowded with quarantine markers. Red rings encircled infected systems. Yellow zones indicated suspected contamination corridors. Hyperspace routes flickered as navigation beacons were remotely disabled or destroyed to prevent civilian transit. Captain Kest studied the data, his voice measured but strained. Sector Command confirms infestations on 4 additional worlds. All agricultural or mining colonies. Response time insufficient to prevent biomass conversion. Projected spread rate? Gorin asked. Accelerating, the tactical officer replied. Each infested world increases spore dispersal and deep space organism production. Exponential growth curve. Silence settled over the bridge like falling ash. Behind Gorin, ISB liaison Marix folded her hands behind her back. Panic reports increasing in mid-rim trade hubs, she said. Refugee traffic overwhelming port infrastructure. Local governors requesting military assistance. Gorin did not turn. We do not have the fleet density to protect every port. No, she said, but we have the authority to close them. The words hung between them. The empire ruled through order. Order required movement, trade, supply chains, labor transport. Closing major ports risked economic paralysis. Leaving them open risked biological annihilation. Gorin exhaled slowly. Prepare quarantine directive. Tier 7. Captain Kest's eyes flicked toward him. Tier 7 was rarely invoked. It authorized planetary isolation enforced by orbital fire. Confirmed, Admiral. Gorin did not hesitate. Confirmed. The directive transmitted outward in encrypted bursts, routed through sector command nodes and Imperial garrisons. Its language was precise, bureaucratic, and merciless. All civilian traffic prohibited. Unauthorized departure subject to destruction. Surface sterilization authorized upon breach of containment. On Niter Prime, the quarantine order arrived 12 minutes after the first reports of infestation in the lower docking districts. Port Eris was already burning from earlier containment strikes, but creep had spread through maintenance tunnels and cargo corridors, emerging in pockets across the port complex like a spreading bruise beneath metal skin. Stormtrooper units fought in coordinated formations, flamethrowers roaring, thermal charges detonating in concussive bursts that shook docking towers to their foundations. Each burn section slowed the creep for minutes, at best, before new growth crept over charred surfaces. Above the port, the Imperial Customs corvette received the quarantine directive and adjusted its orbit. Quarantine level escalated. The gunnery officer reported. Orbital sterilization authorized. Commander Velrose, a man who had spent his career suppressing pirate raids and smuggling rings, stared down at the burning port and the fleeing civilians still trying to reach evacuation ships. "How many are still on the surface?" he asked. "Approximately 80,000, the sensor officer replied. Velrose closed his eyes briefly. "Signal final evacuation warning," he ordered. 2 minutes. The announcement echoed across the port's emergency speakers, cutting through smoke and screams. By order of the Galactic Empire, Port Eris is under quarantine. All remaining personnel evacuate immediately. Surface sterilization will commence. The words triggered a new wave of panic. Civilians surged toward docking bays already sealed or destroyed. Some dropped to their knees, pleading toward the sky. Others ran blindly through smoke-choked corridors, only to encounter skittering shapes erupting from the creep. On the corvette's bridge, the 2-minute timer counted down in silent red digits. Velrose stood rigid, hands clasped behind his back. He did not look away. At 0, he gave the order. Orbital turbolasers fired. Green lances of energy struck the docking complex, vaporizing sections of infrastructure in blinding flashes. Towers collapsed in cascades of molten metal. Shock waves rippled across the port, incinerating biomass and human alike in overlapping spheres of destruction. From orbit, the port became a burning scar. The creep burned. For several seconds, the infestation ceased movement. Then, in the gaps between impact zones, dark tendrils began to creep outward once more. Velrose watched in silence. Continue bombardment. The guns fired again. Across the mid-rim, quarantine beacons activated, projecting navigational warnings that locked hyperspace routes and forced civilian vessels to reroute. Imperial patrols intercepted ships attempting unauthorized departure from infected systems. Some complied. Others ran. The Empire destroyed them. Holonet feeds across the core showed carefully edited footage of Imperial fleets defending populated worlds from an extraterrestrial biological threat. The footage showed turbolasers striking infected terrain, stormtroopers evacuating civilians, medical teams distributing protective gear. It did not show orbital sterilization of refugee ports. It did not show civilians caught between quarantine lines and the creeping advance of living biomass. Rumor filled the gaps propaganda left behind. In the underlevels of Coruscant, whispers spread that the Empire was burning worlds to hide its failure. In the mid-rim, merchant guilds protested route closures that threatened their livelihoods. In rebel safehouses, analysts studied quarantine patterns and saw the shape of a threat too large for insurgency warfare. Even the huts, insulated in their fortified palaces, adjusted their operations. Evacuation routes were sold at obscene prices. Entire populations were relocated for profit. And in secret, hut scientists purchased black market samples of burned Zerg tissue, seeking advantage in whatever future emerged from the crisis. On Concordia, Mandalorian clans watched Imperial sterilization footage in grim silence. Some saw tyranny. Others saw necessity. All saw a war expanding beyond conventional tactics. On Coruscant, The Emperor's advisory council convened beneath vaulted ceilings of polished obsidian and gold. Sector governors appeared via hollow projection, their faces pale in flickering light. Data streams scrolled across the chamber's central display. Infestation vectors, quarantine zones, projected spread models. Moff Talon spoke first, voice tight with barely controlled alarm. We are destroying infrastructure faster than the swarm expands. This is not sustainable. Another governor countered sharply. If we fail to contain it, there will be no infrastructure left to preserve. The debate spiraled, voices overlapping, calculations clashing with desperation. The swarm did not respect political boundaries or economic projections. It converted biomass into expansion. At the head of a chamber, Emperor Palpatine listened in silence, fingers steepled. "Your efforts are commendable," he said at last, his voice soft but carrying effortlessly across the hall. The room fell silent. The Empire has faced rebellion, disease, and insurrection. Each required decisive action. This threat is different. It consumes potential itself. He rose slowly, robes whispering across the polished floor. Containment alone will not suffice. We must understand it. We must learn its nature. And if possible, his eyes glinted, we must harness its power. Several governors exchanged uneasy glances. To rule the galaxy is to master its dangers. Palpatine continued. Fear is a tool. Survival is a mandate. We will ensure both. Far from the core, however, the reality remained brutally simple. Systems were being sacrificed to slow an enemy that multiplied with every victory. In the outer agricultural belt of the mid-rim world devours, farmers stood in silent rows as Imperial transports descended into their fields. Stormtroopers deployed perimeter beacons. Officers distributed relocation orders stamped with the Imperial crest. You have 12 hours to evacuate, one officer announced through a portable amplifier. This sector is designated a containment zone. A farmer stepped forward, dirt still clinging to his hands. We've seen no infestation here. The officer met his gaze without malice. That is why you are evacuating now. The man looked back at his fields, rows of crops cultivated across generations. If we leave, we lose everything. If you stay, the officer said quietly, you may lose more. Above them, spore clouds drifted high in the atmosphere, invisible to the naked eye, but unmistakable to orbital sensors. The swarm did not announce its arrival. It arrived when conditions favored growth. On the relentless, Admiral Gorin studied the updated spread projections. Each sterilized world bought time measured in days. Each quarantine line slowed expansion, but strained Imperial resources and eroded civilian trust. Refugee flows destabilized sectors the Empire could not afford to lose to unrest. Captain Kest stood beside him, watching the display. We are sacrificing worlds, he said. Gorin did not soften the truth. We are preserving the galaxy. Kest hesitated. Will it be enough? Gorin's gaze remained fixed on the spreading red markers. It must be. Outside the viewport, the stars burned with indifferent brilliance. Somewhere among them, the swarm continued its silent harvest, converting life into fuel for expansion. Each quarantine line slowed it. None stopped it. And as the Empire tightened its grip on hyperspace lanes and planetary borders, another consequence began to emerge. Fear turning inward, suspicion poisoning trust, systems questioning whether Imperial protection meant survival or sacrifice. The swarm consumed worlds. The Empire consumed hope to stop it. Between those forces, the galaxy strained toward fracture. The first time an Imperial sensor array saw it clearly, the operator thought the equipment had failed. The return was too large, too smooth, too impossibly organic to be a legitimate contact. It filled the edge of the scope like a second moon, its mass readings fluctuating as if the object were breathing. The operator recalibrated twice, ran diagnostic sweeps, and then, only then, felt the slow tightening in his chest as he realized the instruments were not malfunctioning. They were finally catching up to reality. The Hive Leviathan did not arrive like a fleet. It did not translate from hyperspace with the telltale bloom of energy. It simply emerged from the dark between stars, drawn into the galaxy along the same unseen corridors the Swarm had used to reach Virex 9 and the other devoured worlds. Its silhouette was a continent of flesh and plated bone, ridged with spines the size of towers and threaded with bioluminescent veins that pulsed in slow, deliberate rhythms. Around it drifted smaller organisms in spiraling formations, not random flotsam, but a living escort screen that shifted continuously, like a school of predators protecting a larger hunter. Within hours, quarantine lines in 3 sectors began to fail all at once. Not because the Empire ran out of ships, not because governors defied orders, not because smugglers slipped through patrols. Those problems existed, yes, but this failure was different. It was synchronized. Worlds separated by light years reported the same pattern, creep surging faster than before, hive nodes pulsing in unison, spore clouds thickening and drifting with unnatural purpose. Bioforms that had previously reacted in localized waves began striking with timing that suggested centralized coordination. The Swarm had always been intelligent. Now it was becoming organized on a scale the Imperial Navy understood far too well. Admiral Gorin received the first full report aboard the Relentless as the Star Destroyer held position near an embattled junction system. The bridge lights were dimmed for tactical mode, bathing every face in cold blue. The holodisplay showed 3 infected worlds, 2 suspected vectors, and 1 glowing red icon that dwarfed everything else. Mass estimate? Gorin asked. The sensor officer's voice was tight. Beyond standard Leviathan class readings. It's layered, as if multiple organisms merged. Captain Kest stared at the icon. A mobile hive. ISB Liaison Marix's expression remained controlled, but her eyes flicked toward the quarantine sectors. If it is mobile and coordinating, the Empire's quarantine doctrine becomes obsolete. It will simply reposition the Swarm around our barriers. Gorin's jaw tightened. Then we don't build walls. We cut off the head. The order went out. Converge available assets, form a kill box, target the massive organism before it could anchor itself above another world. Sector fleets responded with grim efficiency. Star destroyers turned like steel continents, escorts falling into formation, TIE wings launching in numbers that made space seem crowded. But as the Imperial fleet mustered, the galaxy's other powers began moving too, not from loyalty, not from shared ideology, but from the simplest instinct left to any civilization staring at extinction. Rebel cells intercepted the same sensor chatter and understood what it meant. If a centralized hive intelligence established stable coordination, there would be no safe lanes, no hidden bases, no time to evacuate. Mandalorian clans received Ral Varud's transmitted data and then watched the new returns with hard-eyed comprehension. Even criminal syndicates adjusted their operations, rerouting smugglers and closing black market ports, because profit meant nothing if there were no living customers left. On Jedha's plateau, Calren Voss felt the shift in the Force like a blade drawn across a throat. The living force did not merely dim now. It shuddered, as if something vast had pressed its weight against the current of existence and forced it into a narrower channel. She rose abruptly, robes snapping in the wind, her senses reaching outward toward the rim where the silence had begun. The Sith beside her, who had not given his name and had not asked hers, stiffened as well, eyes narrowing. "You feel that," he said. Calren's voice was quiet. A conductor. He stared toward the horizon, as if he could see across hyperspace with will alone. No, a throne. Calren flinched at the word, because it matched what she had sensed within the hive nodes. Not merely a mind, but hierarchy. Not random evolution, but direction. The Swarm was becoming something closer to empire than infestation. A distant ship engine whined overhead. A transport descended toward Jedha City, Imperial, based on its silhouette. Calren's hand drifted toward the lightsaber she had not ignited in years. The Sith's fingers curled slightly, as if tasting old reflexes. The transport landed on a scorched platform, and stormtroopers deployed, forming a tight perimeter. Behind them stepped a figure whose presence in the Force was unmistakable even through Calren's careful masking. Darth Vader. He moved with mechanical inevitability, cape dragging through dust, helmet reflecting the pale sunlight. The troopers cleared a path, and a small team of Imperial officers followed, their posture rigid with fear and purpose. Kaurin's breath caught, not from awe, but from the sudden narrowing of options. She could flee. She could fight. She could do nothing. None of those choices felt like enough anymore. Vader stopped at the edge of the plateau, as if he had known exactly where she was. His helmet turned slightly, fixing on her position. The sensation was not visual. It was pressure, like gravity increasing. "You," Vader said, voice a harsh mechanical rasp that carried easily in the wind. "A survivor." Kaurin did not answer. The Sith beside her stepped forward half a pace, then stopped, watching Vader with a predator's stillness. Vader's helmet angled toward him. "And you?" The air between them tightened, charged with a history of betrayal and slaughter. Kaurin felt her pulse quicken, but beneath it was something else now, something she hated admitting. Hope. Because Vader was here, which meant the Empire had recognized the threat as more than a quarantine problem. It meant the Sith, true Sith, not Inquisitors, were paying attention. Vader's gaze returned to Kaurin. "The Emperor requires knowledge. You have been sensing the disturbance." Kaurin's jaw tightened. "Your Emperor caused 1,000 disturbances." Vader's answer was immediate. "This is not one of them." The Sith's voice cut in, low and sharp. "You seek to control what cannot be controlled." Vader did not react the way Kaurin expected. There was no rage, no immediate violence. His helmet remained still, and when he spoke, the words carried a colder weight. "I seek to end what threatens my master's dominion." Kaurin's hands curled into fists. "Then you understand nothing. Dominion over what? Ash? Silence." Vader stepped forward, and the dust at his feet stirred. "You will come." The Sith laughed once, humorless. "And if we refuse?" Vader's presence expanded, the force tightening like an invisible fist. Kaurin felt stones tremble, felt the air thin, felt the old fear of the purge surge in her chest. Then she felt something else, another pressure, distant but immense, rolling through the force like a slow tide. The Hive Leviathan had moved. Kaurin staggered, not from Vader's power, but from the sheer wrongness of what she sensed beyond him. It was as if a vast mouth had opened in the living force and begun drawing breath. Vader paused. His helmet turned away from them, toward the horizon, as if listening. For the first time, Kaurin heard uncertainty in his respirator's rhythm. "This presence," Vader said quietly. "It is not the Force." The Sith's voice sharpened. "It is life without choice." Kaurin made her decision in that moment, not to serve the Empire, not to submit to Vader, not to trust the Sith beside her, but to move toward the only battlefield that mattered now. If the Hive Leviathan anchored itself and coordinated the swarm fully, there would be no future for Jedi ideals or Sith ambitions. There would be nothing. "I'll go," Kaurin said. The Sith's eyes flicked at her. "You're walking into their chains." "I'm walking toward the fire," she replied. "And you're coming too, because you know your power means nothing if the galaxy is devoured." Vader watched them both, and for a moment Kaurin expected him to strike, to punish their defiance with domination. Instead, he turned and signaled to the officers. "Prepare transport," he ordered. "We have a target." Hours later, in a system whose name had already begun to vanish from civilian navigation charts, the Imperial fleet formed its kill box around an empty stretch of space. Star destroyers aligned in layered arcs, their turbolasers charged. Interdictor cruisers activated gravity wells, attempting to pin any movement within the system and prevent escape. TIE wings spread like a black net. The plan was simple, brutal, and familiar to Imperial doctrine. Trap the enemy, overwhelm it with fire, erase it from existence. The Hive Leviathan entered the perimeter, as if it had expected them. It drifted into the trap with slow confidence, its escort organisms fanning outward to meet the TIE screen. The Imperial fleet opened fire at maximum range. Turbolasers lanced into the Leviathan's hide, carving molten trenches that would have crippled a battleship. The creature convulsed, and for a moment it appeared to recoil. Then it pulsed. The pulse did not travel through space as light or sound. It traveled through biology. Across the system, the smaller bioforms reacted instantly, shifting formation, absorbing losses, redirecting. The Leviathan's wounds began to seal, membranes knitting faster than before. New growth hardened over damaged ridges, like armor forming in real time. Fire pattern adjustment. Goran snapped. Concentrate on one quadrant. Burn through before it regenerates. Batteries obeyed. The fleet's fire converged on the Leviathan's forward ridges, saturating the area until space itself seemed to glow. The escort swarm surged toward the Star Destroyers, not to destroy them outright, but to clog point defense arcs with sacrificial bodies, forcing the capital ships to choose between maintaining the barrage or protecting their shields. The TIE wings engaged the swarm, lasers flashing as organic bodies burst into drifting ice and viscous fragments. Yet every destroyed bioform became particulate, spore clouds and debris that clung to shield envelopes, testing for weaknesses, leaching energy in faint luminous webs. Shields fluctuating across the port arc. Captain Kest reported, voice strained. They're using residue as a conductivity layer. Marix's eyes narrowed. They're learning the shield frequency in real time. The kill box began to feel less like a trap and more like a classroom, with the Empire unwillingly serving as instructor. Then the Leviathan did what the Empire had feared it would do. It opened. Along its ventral surface, plates peeled back like the iris of an enormous eye. Inside was not a reactor, not an engine, but a cavernous chamber lined with pulsing sacs and ribbed conduits. The chamber glowed with internal bioluminescence, and within it churned thick clouds of spores and embryonic bioforms. The chamber expelled. A wave of organic matter surged outward, massive, dense, propelled by muscular contraction. It struck the interdictor cruisers first, slamming into their hulls like a tidal wave in vacuum. Organic tendrils latched onto plating seams, digging in. Spore clouds spread across sensor arrays, blinding them. And within seconds, the hulls of the interdictors began to register internal breaches, not from boarding parties, but from living organisms boring inward. Interdictor 1 is losing gravity well stability, a tactical officer shouted. Interdictor 2 reports biointrusion in engineering. Goran's eyes flared with cold fury. Target the ventral chamber. Burn it out. The fleet's fire shifted, but the Leviathan anticipated. Escort organisms surged into the firing lanes, sacrificing themselves by the thousands, absorbing shots, and exploding into residue that further clouded targeting solutions. The Leviathan's ventral plates began to close again, sealing the chamber as if it had merely exhaled and could now endure the response. In the midst of the chaos, an unexpected transmission cut through the comm channels. Encrypted, not Imperial. A rebel-coded burst. Imperial command. This is an independent cell, the voice said, tense and fast. Your kill box is collapsing. Your interdictors are compromised. If you let this thing anchor, it will coordinate infestations across your quarantine lines within days. Captain Kest stiffened. Rebels. Marix's expression hardened. Jamming protocols. Goran cut her off. Let them speak. The rebel voice continued. We have a strike craft with a payload designed for deep tissue ignition. If your fleet creates an opening, one corridor through the escort screen, we can deliver it into the ventral chamber before it seals again. Silence hit the bridge like a physical force. Imperial doctrine did not include cooperation with insurgents. Yet the tactical display did not care about doctrine. It cared about math. And the math was turning against them. Goran's fists clenched behind his back. He could order the rebels destroyed. He could deny them and die with Imperial purity. Or he could accept assistance and live long enough to keep fighting. He made the choice that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. Transmit coordinates, he said. Marix turned sharply. Admiral, this is not a rebellion, Goran said, voice like iron. This is extinction. He issued the next orders with ruthless clarity. All ships, open corridor on Vector 37. Concentrate fire to clear escort organisms. Tie wings, hold that lane. If anything enters it, kill it, unless it matches the provided rebel transponder. The fleet adjusted. Turbolasers carved a path through the organic screen, burning open a narrow corridor of drifting debris. TIE fighters formed a living wall on either side, lasers flashing to prevent the corridor from collapsing under renewed swarm pressure. A small craft, ugly, patched, flying too fast for its fragile silhouette, shot into the corridor. It was rebel engineering at its most desperate. Speed, improvisation, and faith in the impossible. It raced toward the Hive Leviathan as the ventral plates began to open again, preparing another expulsion. Now, Goran whispered. The corridor held by sheer violence and will. The rebel craft plunged straight into the opening chamber, disappearing into the glowing throat of the Leviathan just as its plates began to close. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the Leviathan convulsed. Light erupted from within, not the green flash of turbolasers, but an internal blaze. White-hot ignition spreading through the chamber's sacs and conduits like fire through oil. The creature's bioluminescent veins flared, then flickered erratically. The escort organisms in the surrounding swarm spasmed mid-flight, their coordinated patterns breaking into chaotic motion. They've disrupted it, Captain Kess breathed. Goran did not relax. Fire. Everything. Don't let it recover. The Imperial fleet unleashed hell. Turbolasers saturated the Leviathan's wounded ventral region, tearing open plates now weakened by internal combustion. The creature's regeneration faltered, tissue blackening faster than it could seal. Escort organisms tried to reform defensive lattices, but without perfect coordination, their movements became wasteful, colliding, dying in disarray. The Leviathan's massive silhouette began to drift, losing its slow certainty. Its pulses became irregular. Its internal glow dimmed. And yet, even as it weakened, Kauren Voss, now aboard Vader's transport, held in a containment bay while Imperial officers argued over her status, felt something that chilled her more than any blaster alarm. The presence did not vanish. It split. She closed her eyes and reached into the Force, ignoring the risk of being sensed by Vader. What she felt was not the Leviathan dying. It was the mind behind it fracturing into multiple smaller currents, dispersing like seeds on the wind. The Sith beside her, restrained but alert, felt it too. His eyes widened slightly. "It's not ending," he whispered. "It's dividing." Kauren's throat tightened. "It's ensuring continuity." On the bridge, Goran watched the Leviathan's hull collapse inward, great sections breaking away into drifting masses. The fleet's fire continued until only fragments remained, charred and tumbling. A cheer rose from some officers, brief and disbelieving. Then the sensor officer's voice cut through it like a knife. New contacts. The display populated with multiple smaller organic signatures, emerging not from hyperspace, but from the debris itself. Sections of the Leviathan reorganizing, forming protective shells, drifting away under biological propulsion. Not as massive as the original, but many. "They're escaping," Captain Kess said. Goran's jaw tightened. "Pursue and destroy." Marix's voice was flat. "We don't have the fleet density, and if they scatter..." Goran stared at the spreading contacts and felt the bitter truth settle. They had wounded the beast. They had disrupted the conductor. But the song of consumption would continue, now in many voices instead of one. In the containment bay, Vader stood before Kauren and the Sith, his helmet reflecting the red emergency lights. "You sense something," Vader said. Kauren met the black lenses of his mask. "It's learning from defeat," she said. "It will return different." The Sith's voice was low, almost respectful. "And next time it will not enter your trap." Vader's respirator hissed, slow and heavy. "Then we will become something it cannot predict." Kauren felt the weight of those words. For the first time, the idea of the impossible formed in her mind not as fantasy, but as necessity. A war where Jedi restraint and Sith ambition might both be tools, not rivals. A war where survival demanded cooperation neither side could admit aloud. Outside the viewport, the shattered remnants of the Hive Leviathan drifted like burned islands in the void. The Imperial fleet held position amid debris and spore clouds, engines humming, shields flickering. The rebel craft was gone, its pilots consumed within the creature's throat, but its impact had altered the battle's outcome. The Empire had not won. It had bought time. And in the darkness beyond the system, in the quiet corridors between stars, the Swarm carried new lessons forward, already shaping what it would become next. Time did not heal the galaxy. It only revealed what the galaxy had become. In the days after the Hive Leviathan's destruction, Imperial analysts tried to sell the battle as victory. They compiled weapon cam footage of turbo-laser barges carving through organic armor, edited out the moments when interdictors screamed about internal breaches, and looped the image of the Leviathan convulsing under internal ignition until it looked like the Empire had always been in control. Holonet announcers spoke of a decisive containment action and praised the Emperor's wisdom. The word extinction never appeared on official channels. Panic was a contagion, and the Empire treated it like any other. Isolate, suppress, burn if necessary. Yet the maps did not lie, and the Force did not lie, and the refugee convoys drifting through backwater lanes did not lie. Even with the conductor wounded, the song continued, fragmented, yes, less synchronized for now, but louder in its spread. The Leviathan had not been a singular heart. It had been a scaffold. Its destruction did not end the Swarm's hunger. It taught the Swarm how to survive the galaxy's best attempt to kill it. Admiral Gorin stood on the bridge of the Relentless, staring at the updated threat projection, and he felt the unfamiliar sensation of fighting an enemy whose defeat only strengthened it. The red quarantine rings had stopped expanding for a time, but the yellow suspected zones multiplied, forming a ragged halo around the infected frontier. Every corridor that remained open for commerce became a possible artery for contamination. Every refugee ship was a potential delivery system for spores. Every world that accepted evacuees, no matter how compassionate, became a possible incubator. Spread rate down 20%, Captain Kest reported, voice careful. But not because containment is improving, because the Swarm is reorganizing. Gorin didn't ask how they knew. They knew because the Swarm attacks had changed. No more reckless probing of shield envelopes. No more sacrificial swarms thrown into point defense arcs just to learn. Instead, infested worlds began producing bioforms that hugged the edges of sensor range, that used drifting debris fields and asteroid belts as cover, that clung to freighters, and then released into atmosphere only after arriving in populated lanes. The Swarm was learning patience. It was learning deception. On a mid-rim listening station, an astromech droid replayed recorded hyperspace chatter from a cargo convoy that had vanished 2 days earlier. The last transmission was not a scream. It was confusion, a pilot saying, "We have something on the hull. No, it's inside the..." And then silence, clean and sudden, as if the comm itself had been eaten. On another world, a hospital in a coastal city overflowed with refugees from a burned port. Doctors treated coughs and spore exposure as a respiratory ailment until a patient's skin began to harden into glossy patches. And then the ward became a slaughterhouse when the first brood erupted in the ceiling vents. These were not large-scale invasions. These were seeds. And seeds did not need fleets. They needed time. In the lower levels of Coruscant, fear grew sharper than rebellion ever had. Food prices surged as supply lines faltered. Refugee populations swelled in sectors the Empire could not easily police. Propaganda screens insisted the situation was contained while civilians watched the night sky for smoke columns from sterilized ports. Even the loyal began to whisper the forbidden question. If the Empire could not protect them, what was the Empire for? Palpatine sensed that fear and did not mind it. Fear was still his currency. What concerned him was the other thing. The voids in the Force, the areas where the living force did not ripple with terror or hope, but simply stopped. Regions where the galaxy's natural symphony thinned into a dead hush. In his private chamber, he stood before a star map marked with infected zones and the after-action reports from the Leviathan killbox. His advisor spoke in careful tones about resource allocation and shipyard capacity, about the need to maintain order as quarantine measures eroded public trust. Palpatine listened, nodded, and dismissed them with a wave. When the chamber was empty, he reached out into the Force. The voids responded like wounds. Not bleeding, not burning, simply missing. It was an affront. The dark side could corrupt and twist, but it still used life as fuel. This swarm erased fuel entirely. It denied him the very medium through which he ruled. A knock came at the door. Vader entered, cape sweeping, his presence heavy and controlled. Behind him walked Kauren Voss, bound in magnetic restraints that limited motion but could not bind her awareness. The Sith traveler from Jeddah followed as well, restrained separately, eyes cold and unbroken. Palpatine turned slowly. His gaze landed on Kauren first, and she felt the chilling sensation of being inspected not as a person, but as a tool. "You survived," he said. Kauren kept her voice level. So did the swarm. Palpatine's smile was thin. "We destroyed its greatest asset, the beast that coordinated its spread." Kauren shook her head. "You wounded it. It divided. It learned. Now it will spread in ways your fleet cannot anticipate." The Emperor studied her for a long moment, then shifted his gaze to the restrained Sith. "And you?" The Sith lifted his chin. "The swarm denies both light and dark. It does not tempt. It does not fear. It consumes." Palpatine's eyes narrowed with something like fascination. "Then it is a rival to the Force itself." Vader's mechanical breathing filled the silence between them. "My master," he said, "the fleet requests authorization for expanded sterilization measures. Entire mid-rim trade corridors are collapsing under quarantine pressure." Palpatine's gaze drifted back to the star map. He could burn more systems. He could quarantine half the galaxy. He could enforce order with terror and fire. But even he understood what Goran understood. Sterilization bought time, not victory. Every burned world was a wound in the Empire's body, and an empire could bleed out even if it did not fall to invasion. "We will not merely contain," Palpatine said softly. "We will adapt." Kauren felt her stomach tighten. "By becoming what it is." Palpatine's smile sharpened. "By mastering what it is." He turned slightly, gesturing toward a data slate on the desk, a report extracted from Mandalorian transmissions, flagged by ISB for its high-value details. It contained combat observations, the swarm's reclamation behavior, its rapid adaptation to fire, its hive node structure. It also contained something worse, genetic sample readings from a Zerg node that had reacted strongly to energy frequencies associated with Kyber. Palpatine tapped the report lightly. "This swarm is evolution. It reshapes itself with every lesson. That is its power. The Force reshapes destiny through will. That is mine." Kauren's voice came out sharper than she intended. "The Force is not yours." Palpatine's eyes flicked to her, and for a heartbeat she felt pressure tighten around her chest like invisible fingers. "Not enough to kill. Enough to remind. Everything in this galaxy is mine," he murmured. The Sith traveler let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "Then you will choke on it when there is nothing left to rule." Vader's head angled toward the Sith. A warning. Palpatine lifted a hand, silencing the tension. "You are here because you both sensed what my advisors cannot. You understand the nature of this threat, in ways fleets do not. I will use that." Kauren's skin prickled. "Use us how?" Palpatine's gaze drifted toward the infected zones on the map. "There are places the swarm cannot yet devour without consequence. Worlds steeped in the Force. Nexus points. Ancient sites. If the swarm consumes them, the void will deepen. The galaxy will weaken in ways even it may not anticipate." The implication settled like poison. He was not speaking of saving civilians. He was speaking of protecting power sources. Protecting the Force-rich arteries of the galaxy because they mattered to him. Kauren felt a surge of anger, then forced it down. Anger would not help. Not now. Vader's voice cut through the moment. "We require a weapon that can strike hive nodes faster than they evolve. The fleet cannot be everywhere." Palpatine's eyes gleamed. "Then we create hunters." Kauren's heart hammered. You want to weaponize the Force against them. I want to weaponize everything, Palpatine replied. Outside the palace, beyond the core, beyond the quarantine lines, the war continued on 1,000 fronts. Mandalorians took contracts and learned to burn creep in focus patterns, then retreat before their victory could be reclaimed. Rebel cells coordinated evacuations and sabotage, destroying infected ships before they could reach safe worlds, making choices that stained their consciences but preserved lives. Imperial captains enforced quarantine with ruthless discipline, sometimes saving millions by sacrificing thousands, sometimes failing and watching entire sectors fall silent. And in hidden ruins and forgotten temples, the last Jedi and the darkest, Sith alike felt the same unnatural hush spreading, life being converted into a single hungry chorus. The Swarm had begun consuming the Star Wars galaxy, not in one apocalyptic instant, but in a steady, relentless process that turned worlds into factories and people into raw material. The battle against the Hive Leviathan had proven the galaxy could wound the Swarm. It had also proven the Swarm could endure and evolve. Admiral Gorin's final report to High Command ended with a line he never expected to write in service to the Empire. Victory is not defined by conquest, but by survival. In the depths of hyperspace, new bioforms drifted in the wake of civilian convoys, patient and unseen. On infested worlds, hive structures pulsed, building again, reorganizing, sending out spores not in random clouds, but in deliberate patterns shaped by new intelligence. The Swarm did not mourn its losses. It metabolized them. And somewhere in the living force, Kaurin felt a thin, fragile thread of defiance, still vibrating. Small pockets of life, refusing to be silenced. She did not know if it would be enough. She only knew it was all that remained between the galaxy and the void. The galaxy had survived wars that shattered fleets and toppled governments, but this was a different kind of conflict, one that didn't end with surrender or coronation. The Zerg Swarm did not care who ruled Coruscant, who controlled the core, or who hid in the shadows of the Outer Rim. It only cared that the galaxy was alive, and therefore edible. Even wounded, even fragmented, the Swarm continued to spread like a living law of nature, turning planets into hive worlds and trade lanes into arteries of infection. The Empire's quarantine lines bought time at the cost of trust, burning ports and sacrificing systems to slow a hunger that learned from every blast and every flame. The rebellion saved lives by making unforgivable choices, destroying ships before they could carry spores, sealing doors to prevent entire worlds from becoming incubators. Mandalorians discovered that fire and Beskar could wound the Swarm, but also learned the bitter truth that every kill could be recycled into new strength. And in the Force, Jedi survivors and wandering Sith sensed the same impossible horror. Life being erased so completely it left not darkness, but emptiness. The destruction of the Hive Leviathan proved the galaxy could strike back. It also proved the Swarm could endure defeat and become something sharper, more patient, more deceptive. It would not march openly into another kill box. It would seep through cracks, through refugees, smugglers, neglected outposts, and the blind arrogance of those who believed distance meant safety. The war was no longer about territory. It was about whether the galaxy could remain a place where life sang in the Force at all. In the Emperor's palace, new plans formed, plans not of mere containment, but of adaptation and weaponization. And that was the final, dangerous twist of this era. The Swarm was forcing every faction to evolve, not only biologically, but morally. The galaxy would either become something united enough to survive, or something monstrous enough to win. Because one truth had become unavoidable. Against the Zerg, victory wasn't conquering a world. Victory was keeping a single world from going silent. The multiverse doesn't end here. New invasions, new empires, and new worlds collide daily. If you enjoy deep cinematic what-if scenarios like this, subscribe and join Multiverse Galaxy if